2 women stormed into the courtroom, arguing furiously. One clutched a child to her chest. The other pointed angrily, eyes blazing. "He's my son!" "No! He belongs to me!" The entire courtroom turned tense. And the 60-year-old atheist judge just stared at them, cold, silent, unreadable. Then both women turned to him, voices trembling. "Judge, tell us, whose child is this?" But this wasn't just a question of custody. It was a question of justice, of reason, of faith. The judge flipped through books, recalled his theories. But no answer came. Not a word. Silence fell like a curtain. Then, from the back of the room, a young Muslim lawyer stood up. His voice was calm. His eyes steady. He raised nothing but the Book of God in his hand, and lit the room with the light of the Prophet's wisdom. And when he answered, the courtroom didn't just go silent, it shook. That day, it wasn't just a decision that was delivered. It was a truth, a heart, and a false belief, finally defeated. The air in the courtroom was thick, not with heat, but with tension. The kind of tension that makes your chest tighten before a word is spoken. A soundless pressure that presses against the windows and creeps down the spines of everyone present. Then, the doors slammed open. 2 women stormed in, voices already raised, their faces etched with desperation. One, older, wore a pale blue scarf and held a small child tightly against her chest. Her arms were trembling, not from weakness, but from refusal to let go. The other, younger, eyes wide and tear-filled, pointed accusingly, her finger like a dagger slicing through the air. "He's my son!" the older woman shouted. "No! She stole him while I slept!" the younger screamed back. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a wave. Even the court guards, trained for order, hesitated to interrupt the emotional chaos. The child, maybe 1 year old, was too small to speak, too confused to cry. His eyes darted between the 2 women, not understanding why the hands that once comforted him were now part of a war. At the front of the courtroom sat Judge Armstrong, age 60. He was known across the state not for empathy, but for logic, cold, surgical logic. His thick silver hair was neatly combed, his tie never crooked, and his reputation never shaken. Armstrong was not just an atheist. He was an intellectual militant against religion. To him, belief in God was a flaw in reasoning. Faith, a fairy tale. Emotion, a distraction. He judged with statutes, not sentiments. He looked at the 2 women, both standing now, both pleading for the same child, and for a long moment he said nothing. The room waited. He opened a thick leather-bound law book, flipped a few pages, and stopped. Then closed it again. No section, no code, no clause could answer what sat in front of him, a child, and 2 mothers. "Your Honor," the younger woman sobbed. "Please tell us, whose child is this?" Her voice broke at the end. The older woman's lips trembled, her eyes fixed on the judge like a lifeline. The courtroom fell silent. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. But Judge Armstrong remained still. His silence wasn't thoughtful, it was hollow. As though something within him was cracking. He had presided over hundreds of cases. He had imprisoned men, fined corporations, and once ruled on a case that made national news. But never before had his logic stood this helpless. And that's when it happened. From the far end of the courtroom, a new voice spoke. "If the court allows, may I speak?" Every head turned. A young man stood in the last row. No suit. No badge. Just a plain shirt, neatly tucked, and a velvet-covered book in one hand. He couldn't have been older than 21. The guards didn't stop him. Perhaps they sensed something different in his presence. He wasn't loud. He wasn't angry. But there was weight in the way he stood, like his words were already carrying truth before they were even spoken. Judge Armstrong raised an eyebrow. "And who are you?" The boy took a breath. My name is Musa. I'm a student of law, and a believer in justice. Armstrong's face tightened slightly. A believer? He repeated, almost mockingly. We don't deal in belief here. We deal in evidence. I understand, Your Honor, Musa replied gently. But sometimes, truth is felt before it is proven. There was something in the boy's tone, not arrogance, not defiance, but calmness. A strange confidence without confrontation. The judge, ever the skeptic, studied him for a moment longer, then gestured toward the front. You may proceed, he said, his voice clipped but curious. Musa walked slowly toward the bench. As he passed the two women, both fell quiet. The child stared at him, eyes wide, as if recognizing something, or someone. Standing before the judge now, Musa did not rush. He simply looked around the courtroom, the benches filled with silent spectators, the flickering overhead lights, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Then he turned back to the judge. Before I offer any suggestion or solution, he said, may I ask you something, Your Honor? Armstrong narrowed his eyes. You're asking me a question in my courtroom? Only one, Musa said calmly. The judge folded his arms. Go ahead. Musa looked directly into his eyes. If there is no higher source, no creator, no design, then who created justice? The room tensed again, but this time for a different reason. This wasn't a legal objection. It was a personal one. A question that didn't belong on paper, but in the soul. The judge stared at Musa, lips parted, but no words came. Musa didn't push. Your Honor, he said, this courtroom was built on the idea that truth matters. That right and wrong exist. But if everything came from chaos, who gave us the ability to even care about right and wrong? He let the silence breathe. Because this is not just a case of custody. It's a case of humanity. The older woman sniffled. The younger one wiped her face with her sleeve. Somewhere in the back row, someone whispered, He's right. The judge tried to speak again, but still nothing came. Musa continued, I won't give you the answer to this child's case. Not yet. Because the answer must not just be heard. It must be felt. He placed the velvet-covered book on the table in front of the judge. You said this room deals in evidence. Then let me present mine. Judge Armstrong glanced down at the book. The title shimmered faintly beneath the cloth. He didn't need to read it to know what it was. Musa stepped back, not triumphant, but composed. And the room, once filled with shouts and accusations, now echoed with something much more powerful. Silence. But not the silence of confusion. The silence of something beginning. Something deeper than logic. Something that would soon change everything. Judge Armstrong stared at the velvet-covered book sitting silently on his desk. It felt heavier than it looked. Not physically, but in presence. As if it had its own gravity, pulling not just attention, but something deeper. Something he didn't know how to name. He had ruled on capital cases. Had broken egos, defended law, silenced crowds. But a single question from a young man, barely old enough to shave, had left him speechless. If there is no higher source, then who created justice? That question echoed in the corners of the courtroom. Like it wasn't just said aloud, but planted somewhere inside. Armstrong sat back in his chair, composing himself. You've made your point, he said at last, with a colder tone than before. But this courtroom is not a place for theology. Musa didn't flinch. I agree, Your Honor. That's why I didn't come here to preach. I came here to remind. The judge narrowed his eyes. Remind what, exactly? Musa stepped forward, his hands respectfully behind his back. That there are limits to books, limits to codes. There are moments where logic bends and hearts speak. And in those moments, when law runs dry, what remains is conscience. He paused. Your Honor, Have you ever wondered where conscience comes from? The judge blinked slowly. You're turning this into philosophy. Musa shook his head. No, sir. I'm turning this into humanity. A low murmur swept through the courtroom. People were no longer checking their watches. They were leaning in, holding their breath, forgetting where they were. This child, Musa continued, is not just a matter of DNA or paperwork. He is a living question. And until we admit that there is a part of us that science cannot explain, this court will never find peace. The older woman clutched the child tighter, but her grip softened. The younger woman's anger faded into exhaustion. And the judge? He was listening. Truly listening. For once, not as a legal expert. Not as an atheist. But as a man. What are you asking me to do? Armstrong asked, not harshly this time, but curiously. I'm asking you, Musa replied, to do what judges once did, before laws were written in ink. I'm asking you to remember that justice is not just about rules. It's about what is right. And sometimes, right is not written. Armstrong let that hang in the air for a moment. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. You've spoken well, he said. But you've still avoided the central question. Musa looked up. And what question is that? The judge didn't blink. You still haven't told me whose child this is. Musa smiled faintly. Not with arrogance, but with assurance. And I won't. Not yet. That startled the judge. The courtroom stiffened again. I won't give you an answer, Musa repeated, until I first awaken something that's been sleeping in this room far longer than you or I. Armstrong tilted his head, intrigued. Which is? Conscience, Musa said. Then he turned slowly to face the crowd. I ask for your patience, he said to the courtroom. Because the child's truth will come, but it must come after a deeper truth is felt. He walked gently toward the two women. May I speak to both of you? They nodded, unsure. Please tell me, Musa said softly. What made you fight this hard? The younger woman responded first. I raised him. I fed him. I watched him take his first step. Her voice cracked. The older woman didn't interrupt. She waited. Then said, I gave birth to him. I woke up, and he was gone. I've searched for him every day since. The room quieted. Musa looked at the child. His big, uncertain eyes darted between the two women. He didn't cry. He didn't reach. He simply waited. As I said earlier, Musa continued, now turning back to the judge. I didn't come with emotion. I came with evidence. But not evidence in the traditional sense. He paused. There is a story, perhaps forgotten in our modern age, of a judge who faced a case like this. 2 women. 1 child. No DNA. No testimony. Just tears. He stepped toward the center of the room. That judge didn't flip through codes. He didn't summon lawyers. He looked into the very nature of motherhood. Armstrong listened, hands folded now. The judge asked both women to express milk, in private. Then he weighed it. The woman whose milk was heavier was declared the mother. A gasp fluttered through the audience. Someone whispered, That's genius. Musa nodded slowly. Because motherhood is not a claim. It is a connection. And love leaves weight behind. Armstrong shifted in his chair. Musa turned toward the bench again. Your Honor, may I ask this court to conduct a test, not of law, but of truth? Armstrong raised a brow. A test? Yes, Musa said. With respect and full privacy. I ask that both women express milk into sealed containers. We will weigh them. And let the child's bond be seen in weight, not in words. The judge said nothing. The courtroom was frozen. Finally, after several seconds of silent contemplation, Armstrong nodded. Proceed. Court staff quietly led the women away, ensuring dignity, no judgment, no audience. The containers were placed behind a curtain. What followed was not seen, but felt. Even the faint sounds of crying from the hallway seemed to carry meaning. 15 minutes later, the women returned. Each carried a sealed glass bottle, now handed to the clerk. The clerk weighed them. A hushed moment passed. Then, he whispered something in the judge's ear. Armstrong's face did not change. But his eyes did. He turned slowly toward the older woman. The one who had spoken less. The one whose hands had trembled not with rage, but with grief. He stood. And in a soft, steady voice said, "This child is yours." The courtroom didn't cheer. It didn't move. It simply inhaled as one. The younger woman lowered her head and cried, not in protest, but in release. She looked at the child one last time, and whispered something no one else heard. The child, still in the older woman's arms, looked up at her. And smiled. The judge sat down again. But this time, he didn't look powerful. He looked humbled. He turned to Musa. "You didn't give me a legal verdict," he said quietly. "You gave me something else." Musa stepped forward, his voice gentle. "I gave you what was already here, Your Honor. You just needed to see it." Armstrong looked down at the velvet-covered book again. And for the first time in his career, he didn't feel like the smartest man in the room. He felt like the one who had finally begun to listen. The courtroom felt like a cathedral now. Not in shape. Not in form. But in silence. A sacred kind of silence. The kind that doesn't demand stillness, but invites reflection. The older woman sat quietly, cradling the child in her arms, rocking him gently as he began to fall asleep. The younger woman was still wiping tears from her cheeks, her head lowered in defeat, but not in hatred. She had not been shamed. She had been set free. Judge Armstrong remained seated, leaning slightly forward, his eyes fixed not on the child, but on the young man who had changed the entire trajectory of the case. "Musa," he said, his voice softer than before, "you've solved the matter at hand." Musa nodded respectfully. "But now," the judge added, "I have a question of my own." Musa met his gaze without fear. "You came into this courtroom with nothing but a book and a question," Armstrong continued. "You challenged my foundation without shouting. You brought order without enforcing it." He pointed slightly toward the Qur'an on the table. "And you claim this book is the reason?" Musa stepped closer. "Yes, Your Honor. Not just the reason, but the light." Armstrong narrowed his eyes. "You said earlier that justice isn't born from dust. That it comes from light. But tell me, if your book is so full of light, why is the world of its followers still drowning in darkness?" The air in the room shifted again. This was no longer a trial. It was a confrontation. A necessary one. A man who had spent a lifetime mocking faith was now questioning it with sincerity. Musa paused before replying. Not to stall, but to let the weight of the question settle. Then he spoke, slow and clear. "Your Honor, if a man stands in front of the sun and casts a shadow, do you blame the sun?" Armstrong didn't respond immediately. His expression shifted slightly, as though he hadn't expected the simplicity of the answer to hit so hard. Musa continued, "The light of truth is pure. But when the heart stands in the way, blocked by ego, pride, politics, or pain, it casts shadows. Those shadows don't mean the light isn't real. It just means it's being blocked." A quiet gasp came from someone in the audience. Musa turned toward the crowd. "If Muslims fail, it does not mean Islam fails. Just as if a student fails a test, we don't burn the textbook. We question how it was studied." Armstrong folded his hands tightly. "So you're saying that religion should be judged separately from its followers?" "I'm saying religion should be judged by its source," Musa replied. "Not by those who struggle to live up to it." The judge leaned back, taking that in. The same way, Musa added. You judge law by the Constitution, not by the lawyers who misrepresent it. That struck home. Armstrong let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Musa took a small step forward, but his voice remained even. Your Honor, you've spent your life defending justice. But even justice can be corrupted when its guardians are flawed. That doesn't make justice invalid. It makes it sacred, and in need of protection. He opened the Qur'an gently. And that's what this book does. It protects justice. It defines it. And it calls everyone, rich or poor, man or woman, judge or criminal, to uphold it, even if it goes against their own selves. The judge raised an eyebrow. Even against their own selves? Musa nodded. That's the measure of truth. It doesn't change to suit your side. It changes your side to suit what's right. A pause. Then, tell me, Armstrong said quietly, why haven't I heard this before? Musa tilted his head slightly. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be discovered. It only needs to be remembered. The judge looked around at the room. It no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt like a space between two worlds, the world of what is known and the world of what is possible. He looked back at the Qur'an. Then to Musa. You said earlier that you came here not just to argue, but to awaken. Musa smiled faintly. And have I? The judge didn't answer. But something in his eyes shifted. Then, another voice spoke up. Not from the judge. Not from Musa. But from the crowd. A man in his 40s stood from the second row. Clean suit. Neatly pressed tie. But his face, worn. Exhausted. Haunted. I'm sorry, he said, voice shaking slightly. But I need to ask something. All heads turned. Even Musa looked surprised. The man cleared his throat. I've read the Qur'an, he said. I've fasted. I've prayed. I've done everything I was told to do. But I still feel empty. I still wake up wondering, what's the point of it all? His voice cracked. I'm sorry, he repeated. But I need to know. If this book is the answer, why doesn't it feel like enough? You could hear hearts breaking in the silence that followed. Musa's face softened. Thank you, he said gently. Because that is the most honest question a heart can ask. He turned fully to face the man. Sometimes, we do all the right actions, but we forget the connection. Faith becomes a checklist. Prayer becomes routine. And the soul, which longs not for motion, but for meaning, begins to starve. He paused. It's like eating food without tasting it. You swallow, but never feel full. The man looked down, eyes wet. Musa continued. We live in a world of noise. Notifications. Headlines. Hustle. But the soul isn't fed by noise. It's fed by stillness. He stepped closer to the crowd. And the Qur'an doesn't just speak to the mind. It speaks to the ache inside the soul. That part of you that wonders at 2 a.m. why you feel so far from everything, even when everything is in front of you. The man closed his eyes. Musa said, the soul wasn't made for this world. It was made for something higher. And until it returns to what created it, it will always feel homesick. Another whisper passed through the courtroom. This time, not of words, but of recognition. The judge watched in silence. He wasn't scribbling notes anymore. He was absorbing truth. Musa turned back to him one last time. You asked why this book is different, he said softly. Because it doesn't just answer your questions. It answers the ones you were afraid to ask. Judge Armstrong didn't speak for a long while. He simply sat there, staring at the Qur'an. Not with hostility. Not even with skepticism anymore. But with something unfamiliar. Stillness. As if the courtroom, the laws, the titles, none of it mattered right now. Just the questions. and the fact that for the first time in his career, he didn't feel in control. The man who had just poured his heart out returned to his seat, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his suit. His tie now loosened, his posture less upright, but his soul, maybe a little lighter. The courtroom remained silent, waiting. All eyes turned back to the young man who had started it all. Musa stood still. His hands folded gently in front of him. His face composed. He didn't bask in the silence. He respected it. Then Judge Armstrong finally asked the question that had been building. "You said this book speaks in signs," he said slowly. "Signs that invite, not force. That reveal, not demand." Musa nodded. Armstrong pointed slightly toward the Qur'an again. "And you said it even mentions milk?" "Yes," Musa replied. "Milk. A liquid so simple, and yet so profound." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Convince me." Musa stepped toward the center of the courtroom. His voice remained calm, but his words carried weight. "Your Honor, milk is among the most overlooked miracles in our lives. It is created inside the body of a mother, or an animal, with no additives, no machinery, no instructions. Just purity." He glanced toward the clerk, who instinctively pulled up a chair. "In every mammal," Musa continued, "milk is formed through a complex process. Blood circulates. Nutrients are extracted. Waste is filtered. And between that comes milk. White, pure, nourishing." He paused, letting the audience visualize it. "Yet it never mixes with the blood, nor with the waste. Something intelligent, something intentional, separates the sacred from the impure." Armstrong leaned forward slightly. Musa took a deep breath. "And in the Qur'an, this process is described in detail. At a time when there were no labs, no microscopes. A time when people believed milk simply happened." The judge's eyes twitched. He wasn't writing anything anymore. He was remembering. The velvet book. The glass of milk. The earlier test between the two women. This wasn't just coincidence. It was orchestration. Musa walked gently toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor, earlier we used milk to determine a mother's bond. But now I want to show you something deeper." He gestured toward a staff member, who brought forward a small tray. On it, a simple glass of milk. The same one that had been sitting on the edge of the judge's bench earlier. Untouched. But now, somehow, it felt different. Armstrong stared at it. "What is this?" Musa didn't rush his answer. "This is a whisper from the unseen. A sign." He stepped beside the tray. 14 centuries ago, a man who couldn't read or write recited words describing the origin of milk from inside cattle, exactly as modern science would later discover. Word for word. The courtroom listened with breath held. Musa turned to the crowd. "And the book that spoke those words has never been changed. Not edited. Not revised. Not corrected." He turned back to Armstrong. "Yet it spoke about embryology. Ocean barriers. Iron in space. And this glass of milk?" The judge didn't speak. But his hand moved slightly. Toward the glass. Not to drink, but to acknowledge. To feel. Musa leaned in gently, but didn't touch the bench. "You asked me why people who follow this book still struggle," he said softly. "And I told you, don't confuse the sun with the shadow." He gestured toward the milk. "This glass doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It just exists. And yet it carries a message louder than most philosophers ever spoke." The judge blinked. And blinked again. "This milk," Musa added, "was once just cells. Blood. Water. Now it's nourishment. Life. Mercy." He paused for effect. "And that's exactly what this book does to a soul." Silence. A kind of sacred, waiting silence. Then Armstrong whispered, almost to himself. If this is your evidence, it's better than any I've read in my entire library. Musa didn't smile. He simply nodded. Because it wasn't written by man. It was sent from man. Just then, a woman from the back row raised her hand timidly. No one had ever raised their hand in a courtroom like this before. Can I ask something? She said, her voice trembling. The judge looked at her. Then at Musa. Musa nodded. Please. The woman stood. She looked to be in her 50s. Modest dress. Simple scarf. Her eyes swollen from tears she hadn't yet cried. I've been Catholic all my life, she said. But nothing ever reached me the way your words just did. She glanced at the glass of milk. At first I thought this was a court case. But now, her voice cracked. It feels like something inside me is waking up. The audience said nothing. They felt the same. Musa responded with compassion, not superiority. Because truth doesn't scream. It whispers. It waits for your heart to quiet down, and then it knocks. He turned to the judge again. Your Honor, you once said that justice lives in books, not beliefs. Armstrong nodded slowly. Musa placed his hand gently over the Qur'an. Then maybe, it's time to ask if this book was never just belief. Maybe it's the source of justice itself. The judge stared at him. And this time, his silence didn't feel like resistance. It felt like surrender. Not weakness, but understanding. Something inside him had moved. And the glass of milk still sat between them. Simple. Still. Silent. But somehow more powerful than anything that had been said in the room. Because truth doesn't need to raise its voice. It only needs to be seen. Judge Armstrong's fingers hovered just above the glass of milk. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't thirsty. He hadn't moved much in over an hour. And yet, that one simple object, the same one he had ignored when it was first placed before him, now felt heavier than the law books stacked across his desk. He didn't touch it. But he didn't look away either. Musa waited. He had said all he needed to. At least for now. And somehow, the silence in the courtroom no longer felt empty. It felt intentional. Then, without warning, the door at the back creaked open. An elderly man entered slowly, hunched over, with soft footsteps and a strand of wooden prayer beads in his fingers. No one remembered seeing him before. No one had noticed him leave earlier. He walked with the ease of someone who wasn't in a rush, and the confidence of someone who had been invited, not summoned. He walked to the front of the room, past the seated spectators, past the two women, past the glass of milk. And then, he did something no one expected. He gently placed his hand on Judge Armstrong's shoulder. The judge didn't flinch. Didn't resist. The man leaned down and whispered something, too soft for anyone else to hear. Then, just as silently as he had arrived, he walked out through the same door. No name. No title. Just presence. Armstrong's gaze dropped. His hand, still near the glass, now trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from fatigue. As though something inside him had been carrying a burden for years, and it had finally cracked. He looked up at Musa again. I've judged thousands of people, he said, his voice strained. But I never judged myself. Musa took a breath. His eyes softened. You didn't need to, he replied. Your silence judged you for you. A murmur ran through the audience. But Musa didn't stop there. You were taught to silence others. To control a room. To rule with reason and law. And you were good at it. He stepped closer. But justice without a soul is like a body without breath. Armstrong closed his eyes. For a few long seconds he didn't move. And then, he opened them again. They were glossy. Not with rage, but with recognition. I never hated God, he whispered. I just didn't understand him. Musa nodded slowly. And that's why you're close. The judge blinked. Close? Yes, Musa said gently. Because confusion is not the end. It's the beginning. Doubt isn't the enemy. A closed heart is. The judge's hands trembled again. I've read religious texts, he murmured. All of them. I studied them to tear them apart. And yet, Musa said, here you are, reading without your eyes. Armstrong's lips parted. But he said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say that his heart hadn't already whispered. Musa continued. You once said belief was a prison? The judge nodded faintly. But today, Musa added, it's a door. There was a pause. Then Armstrong looked around the room. He didn't see lawyers anymore. Or plaintiffs. Or clerks. Or books. He saw people. People crying. People shaking. People who had come for a legal decision, but found something else entirely. He looked back at the Qur'an. I don't know all the verses, he said. I don't know Arabic. I don't even know where to begin. You already did, Musa whispered. And then, softly, almost broken, Armstrong said, I believe. A gasp spread through the courtroom like the breath of 1,000 stories released at once. Musa stepped forward. He extended his hand. If you're ready, he said, you can say the words. Not for them. Not for me. Just for the one who's been waiting. The judge's voice cracked as he replied, I don't need a microphone. You don't need a stage, Musa said. Just a sincere heart. And so, where gavel once ruled and files once stacked, the most unexpected sound rose from the front of the courtroom. A voice of a man who had fought belief his entire life, now surrendering to it. I bear witness, he said slowly, that there is no one worthy of worship, except the one true God. And I bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger. Tears. Gasps. Hands covered mouths. But no one clapped. Because truth doesn't need applause. It only needs presence. The judge, now simply a man named Armstrong, lowered his face into his hands and wept. Not out of shame. Out of release. Musa placed a hand on his shoulder. Welcome home. Then, another voice rose. It was the man in the suit, the one who had broken down earlier. He stood up, voice shaking, but firmer than before. I want to say it too. Musa turned to him. Then say it. And he did. I bear witness that there is no God but God. And I bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger. Then a third. A teenage boy in the second row. Then a woman from the back, an elderly lady who had once clutched a rosary. One by one, hearts unfolded. Like flowers that had been waiting for light. Even the journalist in the far corner, who had come only to write a courtroom report, stood with tears in her eyes. I've reported on 100 court cases, she whispered, but I've never witnessed truth like this. She said the words too. And now, the courtroom, once a place of judgment, had become a place of return. A place of healing. A place of light. Musa stood still. The Qur'an still lay on the table. The glass of milk still glowed in the soft overhead light. And Judge Armstrong, now just Brother Abdullah, whispered, I used to rule over others. Now, I want to live under what's real. Musa nodded. Then your verdict, he said, has finally been delivered. And this time, it wasn't written on paper. It was written in hearts. The courtroom didn't return to normal. It couldn't. Moments after Brother Abdullah whispered his testimony, the room didn't react with applause or cheers, it reacted with stillness. Deep, emotional stillness. And then, one voice broke the silence. I want to say it too. Everyone turned. It was the man in the gray suit, the one who had earlier broken down with raw confusion. But now, His voice was calm. Anchored. Musa nodded to him. He stood and, voice trembling yet sure, said the words. I bear witness that there is no God but God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger. A quiet gasp rippled across the room. Then a teenager stood up. His hands shook, but his eyes were steady. He repeated the same words. Then came an elderly woman, who had been quietly weeping in the corner. Her hands clutched a small cross, but her heart was ready. She whispered her testimony with closed eyes and open tears. Even the journalist, once sitting in the back row, typing notes with journalistic detachment, slowly lowered her pen. I've written about courts my whole life, she said. But I've never seen justice like this. She stepped forward, placed her hand over her heart, and said the Shahida. No one had been invited. No one had been called. But the truth had called them all. In just a few minutes, 7 people stood transformed, not by pressure, but by presence. The glass of milk still sat silently near the judge's bench, untouched. Yet everyone felt as though it had delivered something powerful. A message that bypassed words and pierced directly into the soul. Musa remained still. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply looked around the room. At the hearts awakened, the eyes opened, the weight lifted. And then, Brother Abdullah, formerly Judge Armstrong, looked around the courtroom he once ruled. His gaze moved slowly across the faces, many still emotional, some now glowing. I used to sit up high and pass judgment on people, he said. But I never knew what justice meant, until I knelt down in front of something greater. Musa smiled faintly. Justice doesn't begin when we punish. It begins when we surrender. That day, the courtroom did not witness just one conversion. It witnessed a wave. Not of religion imposed, but of hearts finally allowed to feel. Days passed. The courtroom never returned to its old role. It had quietly transformed into a new space, one of conversation, of questions, of light. The judge's bench was removed. Chairs were placed in circles. And at the center, every week, people gathered. It was no longer about law. It was about learning. Brother Abdullah sat humbly before a group of curious minds. Among them was Emily, a thoughtful young woman with a background in philosophy. She had listened in silence for days, taking notes, highlighting lines in a translated Qur'an. But today, she raised her hand. Can I ask something? She said. And I hope it doesn't sound disrespectful. Abdullah smiled. Ask it anyway. Respect isn't in the wording, it's in the intention. She nodded. How do I know if I've really found the truth? What if I'm just emotionally moved? What if this feeling fades? The group leaned in, as if they too needed this answer. Abdullah took a moment. Truth doesn't need to scream, he said. It aligns. Aligns? She repeated. He nodded. Yes. When your mind, your heart, and your soul are all facing the same direction, that's alignment. That's truth. Real truth doesn't just make sense, it feels right, and it settles something deep inside. Emily looked down. I want to believe, she whispered. But I don't want to fake it. Then you're already close, Abdullah said. Because sincerity is the key. Just then, Hussein, the former businessman who had once cried in that same courtroom, shared his first Ramadan story, how he fasted alone in a house still full of wine and regrets. He had dates, water, and silence. But I've never felt so full in my life, he said quietly. The circle went quiet. Then, the door creaked open. A little girl entered, Hussein's daughter. Baba! I finished another surah. She ran to him and sat in his lap, Qur'an in her tiny hands. Emily watched this, watched the love, the light, the legacy, and her eyes shimmered. She looked at her own hands. She had been holding on to doubt. But maybe, it was time to let go. That evening, after most of the students had left, Emily remained seated. Her hands rested over a green velvet Qur'an she hadn't opened yet. Not out of fear, but because she already knew. Musa returned quietly from the hallway, carrying his own Qur'an, the same one he had once placed in front of a defiant judge. He smiled at her. "I heard your question," he said softly. "About knowing if you're ready." Emily looked at him, unsure. "And?" Musa sat beside her. "You don't ask that question unless your heart already knows." She blinked. "I'm scared." "You're not scared of the truth," he said. "You're scared of stepping into something that will change you forever. And that's natural." He placed the Qur'an in front of her. "You don't need to rush. Just walk through the door." She looked at the book, then at Musa. "I think I'm ready." And slowly, with sincerity deeper than certainty, she said the words. "I bear witness that there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is his messenger." No one clapped. They didn't need to. Truth doesn't need celebration. It just needs surrender. Brother Abdullah embraced her, eyes glassy. "You didn't find something new," he said. "You returned to what was always inside you." 1 year after that courtroom verdict, the room had changed. No longer a place of rulings. Now, a place of return. And on the wall, a wooden plaque read, "They came for justice. They left with light."